In this video, I'm going to be talking about James Baldwin's Sonny's Blues. So let's go ahead and turn to Canvas. Okay, so before you read, I want you to check out some of these supplemental materials I posted. The first one is a video in which Toni Morrison talks about, why she writes the way she does about the Black experience. So you might find that interesting. The second video is about the Harlem Renaissance, which really happened in the 1920s. But James Baldwin does pull influence from the concepts in it. But the main thing they talk about is this idea of double consciousness. So what it is to be a Black man living in America and writing about that experience, right? Those two kind of identities that are in conflict, right? Because you're also living in a time in which there's, racism, there's white supremacy, and it's rampant. And so that experience is really conflicting when you're a writer, but also talks kind of about the themes that Black writers are really exploring. Very much like the Renaissance period and Shakespeare's time, it's a different identity, but they're still asking questions of like, what is the meaning of life? What is my purpose? Why am I here? Is there a God? Like, how can there be so much suffering and hatred and a God at the same time? And so there's really the exploration of those ideas, very much existentialist, but geared towards the Black experience. So as far as Sonny's Blues, while it doesn't take place during the Harlem Renaissance, it's very much inspired by the ideas of the Harlem Renaissance, right? And so Sonny's Blues was written by James Baldwin in 1957. James Baldwin's an interesting person because, again, he's dealing with not just double consciousness, but really triple consciousness, because he's a Black writer living in America, but he's also a queer writer living in America. So he's dealing with being a queer Black man, in America, who's also a preacher. I mean, there's so many levels to James Baldwin. He really explores that in his writing. He's also authored books like Giovanni's Room, Go Tell It on the Mountain, If Beale Street Could Talk, and The Fire Next Time. And while none of these have won Pulitzer Prizes, which is a travesty, they are so important to the literary canon. And so definitely, if you get a chance to check them out, Giovanni's Room in particular deals with the idea of queer Black identity in America. It's almost confessional in a sense. So I would definitely suggest that you guys read that if you're interested. Now, Sonny's Blues. So basically the story revolves around the narrator and his little brother, Sonny. And I would say that this story is kind of interesting because it could be considered a Bildungsroman, which is just a fancy word for saying a coming-of-age story. So about someone's growth story, right, of going from adolescence to adulthood, or an awakening that happens. But it's also a Kunstroman, which is an artist's coming-of-age story because, Sonny is an artist and he's really developing his craft as an artist. But the story's interesting because it's not just about Sonny, it's also about the narrator and the Black experience. So it's just so many levels to it. We do learn that the narrator is Sonny's older brother. We don't know his name, but we know that he is married to a woman named Isabel. He lost a daughter named Grace, which is interesting again, the kind of symbolism there. Her name is Grace. She symbolizes hope, and then she dies, which is pretty horrible. He is ex-military. He's an algebra teacher, and he lives in a home in a segregated area. And so it's a dangerous area for young Black men particularly. They get pulled into things like drugs, right? Sonny ended up getting pulled into heroin addiction. And the story is about how Sonny comes home from rehab from that heroin addiction. And also, the two brothers really trying to figure each other out because they are so different. And, the narrator doesn't really understand Sonny. Sonny doesn't understand why the narrator is so closed off emotionally. We do learn about things like generational trauma, trauma that is passed down. And this is not just generational trauma, but this is like cultural trauma, right? From, being children of ex-slaves, like just that whole trauma that's passed down, that is still reverberating even today. We learn that the father's brother, who is very much like Sonny, died. Actually, he was murdered by a car full of white men that ran him over one night. We learn that Sonny's uncle was also a musician, just like Sonny. And the father was so traumatized by this event that he witnessed that he became an alcoholic. Sonny is also an addict. So again, there's just this like generational trauma that is passed down. There's some really interesting scenes in this story that I would love for you guys to check out if you can. Um, there's one on page, I believe it's, 26 and 27, that kind of goes into, talks about these children in this living room with these elders, and the lights are off and the elders are talking. And as soon as the light gets turned on, the children are filled with darkness. It's almost this paradox, right? And it kind of reminds me of Emily Dickinson's Tell the Truth But Tell It Slant. Like, these elders are talking about the traumas they're facing in their lives as being, you know, Black individuals in America, and what that means and how dangerous it is, and how, people hate them, and how they have to deal with, struggle and oppression. And they, the children are aware, but again, the adults don't really want to tell them too much. It's an interesting scene that I suggest that you read, and I think it really echoes what Sonny's going through, right? Sonny was not prepared for what life was going to throw at him, and so he's been turning to addiction because he can't deal with the fact that he is so sensitive and he feels the reverberations of this trauma. At the very end of the story, there's this beautiful scene with him and his brother. So his brother goes to listen to him play, and has this moment where his brother has his own awakening, this moment of recognition. And I'm just going to read a little of this here. Freedom lurked around us, and I understood at last that he could help us be free if we would listen, that we would never be free until we did. Yet there was no battle in his face now. I heard what he had gone through and would continue to go through until he came to rest in earth. He had made it his. That long line of which we knew only Mama and Daddy, and he was giving it back, because everything must be given back so that passing through death, it can live forever. So he's really having this moment watching his brother play where he feels all the emotion his brother feels, right? The blues is kind of awakening him, just how Sonny says it awakens him. And then at the end, there's a glass that is put on top of the piano in which Sonny is playing that reverberates. It's a glass of scotch and some milk. And milk, as we know, is a really significant thing. It can symbolize innocence, life, fertility, childhood. It's an interesting that he said milk specifically. But at the end it says, "For me then, as he began to play again, it glowed and shook above my brother's head like the very cup of trembling." So a lot of people have a lot of ideas about what this might mean. Some people think it symbolizes, again, the destruction of the world waiting outside, a foreshadowing of what is to come, the pain and suffering that is plaguing them. And some people actually think of it as like a absolution of that trauma, that it is healing, and almost like a communion, right? Like I don't know, biblical sense. But it really depends on your own interpretation. But anyway, there's just so much to the story, and it's really beautiful, and I hope you enjoyed reading it.